There's a small town in Colorado. It's made up, obviously. It sits at about 8,000 feet elevation, somewhere in the snowy part of the state. And absolutely nothing about it works the way towns are supposed to work. The laws of physics are more like polite suggestions. The adults are all, to a man and woman, completely useless. A kid dies roughly every week and nobody ever seems to notice. This is South Park, and tonight we're going to spend a couple of hours just sitting with it. So get yourself sorted, pillow where you want it, blanket situated if you got one, lights however low you like them. If there's a drink of water near you, good. This is a long one. We're looking at over 2 hours of rambling through one of the strangest pieces of television ever made, and there is absolutely no rush. You're also completely welcome to fall asleep whenever you want. That's kind of the point of these videos. If you drift off somewhere in section 4, lovely. If you make it all the way to the end, also lovely. The script doesn't care what you do, and neither do I. What we're going to do tonight is work our way through the things about South Park that have quietly been sitting in the background of the show for decades. Some of these are confirmed in the actual episodes. The writers put them there on purpose and left them for people to notice. Others are genuine fan theories that the show has never denied, but also never confirmed. I'll be flagging which is which as we go, because I think this is canon and this is what fans think should feel different, even in a rambly late-night sort of video like this one. We'll also detour now and then into lore about how the show even came to exist, because honestly, some of the behind-the-scenes stuff is as weird as the theories themselves. A couple of the most important reveals in the entire series are hidden inside episodes that you can't stream anywhere anymore. One of the main characters is based directly on the guy who writes him, and there's a production cycle that frankly shouldn't be possible. We'll get to all of it, but if it's all right with you, we're going to start at the beginning, not with the boys or the town or any of the mysteries. With how this show, a cultural institution that's been running for nearly 3 decades now, started life as a video Christmas card someone made on construction paper. Here's a strange little detail to start with. In the very first animated short that Trey Parker and Matt Stone made together back in 1992 while they were still in film school, the chubby kid in the red jacket wasn't called Cartman, he was called Kenny. That's his name in the short. The name Kenny eventually got reassigned to the poor kid in the orange parka, and the chubby character became Eric Cartman. But for a while there, the archetype was wearing the wrong label. I love that. It's the kind of thing that makes the whole operation feel less like a polished TV show and more like something a couple of mates put together in a basement and never fully tidied up. That first short was called Jesus vs. Frosty, and if you've never seen it, it looks exactly like you'd imagine a 1992 film student project to look. Construction paper, scissors, a stop-motion camera, and 4 crude little cardboard children watching Jesus fight a killer snowman. It's extraordinarily rough. You can see the fingerprints on the figures. The lip sync is basically non-existent. It's charming in the way that genuinely unpolished things are charming, and it is miles away from anything you'd recognize as the modern show. Then in 1995, a few years later, something genuinely interesting happened. A guy named Brian Graydon, who was an executive at Fox at the time, commissioned Parker and Stone to make a similar short as a video Christmas card that he could send to his friends. So they made a second one called Jesus vs. Santa with the same 4 kids, now slightly closer to their eventual designs. He paid them around $1,000 for it and sent it out on VHS. And this is where it becomes a proper bit of pre-internet folklore. The tape got dubbed and then redubbed and then passed around. It was essentially the 1995 version of a viral video, except the distribution network was a bunch of Hollywood executives photocopying each other's things and passing them hand to hand at parties. The short ended up in the hands of everyone who mattered in American television, and by the time someone at Comedy Central said, "We should turn this into a series," the groundwork had already been laid by a VHS tape that was basically being chain-mailed around Los Angeles for a year and a half. The pilot, Cartman Gets an Anal Probe, aired on Comedy Central on August 13th, 1997. And here's a fun fact that I always come back to when I think about the show. That pilot was made the way the original shorts were made, actual construction paper, actual cutouts, actual stop motion. It took 3 months to produce a single 22-minute episode. You can imagine Parker and Stone at the time realizing quite quickly that if the show got picked up, they could not keep working at that pace. A weekly series cannot be 3 months per episode. The maths does not work. so they switched to computer animation, but they made a specific decision that I think is one of the more underrated aesthetic choices in TV history. They deliberately made the computer-animated version look like the construction paper version. The jerky movements, the flat shapes, the visible seams between body parts. None of that is a limitation of the technology. It is a choice. They could have animated South Park to look like any modern cartoon at any point, but they have stuck decade after decade with an aesthetic that's meant to look homemade. The look was also not their idea exactly. They have both said in various interviews that the cutout style is directly inspired by Terry Gilliam's animations for Monty Python's Flying Circus, which, if you've ever seen one of those Gilliam cutout bits, feet stomping on tiny cardboard figures, giant paper heads chewing people up, makes complete sense. South Park is Monty Python's animation sensibility, grown up, moved to Colorado, and put in charge of an entire show. Now, about the production cycle. This is the bit that I find genuinely hard to believe every time I think about it. Most animated sitcoms take about 8 or 9 months to produce a single episode. The Simpsons, Family Guy, Bob's Burgers, all roughly that timeline because animation is time-consuming work. South Park, since around season 4, has been running on a 6-day production cycle. 6 days. From writing to voice recording, to animation, to scoring, to final cut, to satellite uplink, to Comedy Central. The whole thing gets made in less than a week. There's a documentary about this called 6 Days to Air, which came out in 2011, and if you've never watched it, it's a genuinely fascinating piece of behind-the-scenes stuff. You see Parker writing the script on Thursday morning. You see about 70 people working 120-hour weeks to hit the Wednesday night slot. You see episodes arriving at the network with hours to spare, sometimes minutes to spare. The footage of people just staring at rendering progress bars at 4 in the morning is really something. The reason they do it this way is also the reason South Park is able to comment on current events in ways that almost no other animated show can. If something huge happens on a Monday, South Park can have an episode about it on a Wednesday, 9 days later. That's not physically possible for most animation. For South Park, it's just a Wednesday, a few more bits about how the show came together because I think they're nice to know. The theme song is performed by the band Primus. Les Claypool wrote it and performs it. It runs at 144 beats per minute, and it's gone through several different versions over the years. The original one, a techno remix, a bluegrass version for seasons 6 through 10, and then the rock version that's been running more or less since season 10. The intro has been updated and re-recorded multiple times, but the Claypool bass line is always somewhere underneath it. The town itself, the fictional South Park, is modeled on a real place, Fairplay, Colorado. Parker grew up in the area. If you look up photographs of Fairplay, you'll see the mountain geography and the small town feel that the cartoon is clearly referencing. The real South Park Basin is the actual valley where Fairplay sits. None of the fictional town's weirdness is there, obviously. Fairplay is, from all accounts, a perfectly normal small Colorado mountain town. It just happens to share its bones with the weirdest animated town on television. One last thing, because I find it genuinely lovely. In the early DVD commentaries, particularly the Season 3 one, Parker and Stone openly admit they are extremely dissatisfied with most of Season 2. They don't think it's good. They say so, plainly, sitting there recording commentary over episodes they helped make. That kind of self-critique is rare in showrunners, and it gives you a sense of the two of them. They are constantly measuring what they've made against what they wanted to make, and they are not precious about admitting when it didn't land. This is the production culture that sits underneath everything else we're going to talk about tonight. A show that started as a video Christmas card. A show that is still animated to look like paper cutouts because the creators like how paper cutouts look. A show that turns around episodes at an impossible pace. A show whose creators will openly tell you which season they think is rubbish. You need to know all of that before we get into the theories, because it changes how you read a lot of the mysterious stuff. The show isn't carefully planning 20 seasons of foreshadowing. It's being made by 2 guys and a skeleton crew at roughly the speed of thought. Some of what looks like deep mythology is deep mythology. And some of it is what happens when you're writing at 4 in the morning on a Tuesday and you need a plot device. Which, speaking of the people who make the show, brings us to the other thing that you really need to know before we can talk about anything else, which is that one of the 4 main characters, probably the most important one, depending on who you ask, is essentially a cartoon version of the man writing him. I want to tell you about a thing that took me years to notice, which I think might be true for a lot of longtime South Park watchers. There's a moment at some point, usually after you've watched the show for ages without thinking about it too hard, where you realize that Stan Marsh's parents have very specific names, Randy and Sharon. And then, if you've ever looked into Trey Parker's biography, you remember that his parents, his actual real-world parents, are also named Randy and Sharon, and you sit with that for a second. And then you notice a few other things, and the whole show starts to look a bit different. Here's the short version. Stan Marsh is based on Trey Parker, Kyle Broflovsky is based on Matt Stone. Both creators have said this in interviews. It is not a theory, it is the architecture of the show. But knowing that and actually letting it sink in are 2 different things, and I think letting it sink in changes how you watch the show more than almost any of the weirder theories we'll get into tonight. Let's go through the Stan side first, because it's the more direct one. Trey Parker grew up in Conifer, Colorado, which is a mountain town in the same general region as Fairplay, which, as we talked about earlier, is the model for the fictional South Park. Parker's real dad, the actual human Randy Parker, is a geologist. In the show, Stan's dad, Randy Marsh, is also a geologist. That is not a coincidence. That is a biographical detail dropped directly into the cartoon and left there for 28 seasons. Sharon Marsh, Stan's mom, shares a name with Parker's actual mother, as I mentioned. And while we don't get many specifics about the real Sharon Parker, the dynamic between Randy and Sharon on the show, the long-suffering wife managing a husband who is, let's be polite about it, not especially emotionally developed, is the kind of dynamic that tends to come from somewhere specific rather than being invented whole cloth. I'm not saying the real Parkers are exactly like the cartoon ones. I'm just saying that when a writer uses his own parents' names, he's usually drawing on at least some of what he grew up watching at the kitchen table. The other really interesting bit is that Stan himself as a character is explicitly described as the everyman. Look at any official description of him and that's the word that comes up. Average, normal, level-headed, the grounded one, which is exactly the role Parker seems to play in the real-life Parker-Stone creative partnership. Matt Stone in interviews tends to be the more overtly opinionated, more politically edgy, more visibly frustrated one. Trey Parker tends to be the quieter, more focused, more technical one. He's the one who writes most of the scripts. He's the one who directs most of the episodes, over 300 of them at this point. He's the one whose face you see less often. If Matt Stone is Kyle wearing his convictions on his sleeve and getting into arguments about them, then Trey Parker is Stan, standing slightly to the side of the chaos and trying to figure out how to deal with it. And that's the other thing about Stan. In the show, he's often the one who gets overwhelmed. He's the one who, as he gets older, starts developing what the show clearly codes as depression. He drinks in season 15. He has a hard time with his parents divorcing. He has a hard time with growing up in general, even though he never technically ages past 4th grade. The show lets Stan carry the emotional weight of what it might feel like to live in South Park if you were actually a kid, actually paying attention, actually bothered by what was happening around you. Now Kyle. Matt Stone has been pretty open about Kyle being based on him. Kyle is Jewish, Matt Stone is Jewish. Kyle has strong moral convictions and a short temper about people violating them. Matt Stone, by his own account, has strong moral convictions and a short temper about people violating them. Kyle and Stan's friendship, the real emotional center of the show, is meant to reflect Parker and Stone's actual friendship. They have said this in interviews, the fact that those two have been friends since university and have collaborated continuously for over 30 years is arguably the most stable creative partnership in modern American entertainment. And it's sitting, encoded, inside the friendship between 2 cartoon 4th graders. This is where it gets uncomfortable, in a really interesting way. Because of that encoding, the show cannot depict Stan and Kyle's friendship falling apart without it reading, on some level, as a commentary on the real friendship between the people making the show. And the show has, more than once, depicted that friendship falling apart. The clearest example of this is the post-COVID special from 2021. In that special, we see the boys as adults, 40 years in the future. Stan has moved away from South Park. He's estranged from Kyle. He works as an online whiskey consultant, which is a sad little job for a grown man. And his estrangement from Kyle is explicitly called a broship that ended. The word used in the script is pretty close to a wound, which surprised me the first time I watched it. It wasn't played for laughs. It was played with actual sadness. The thing is, that episode is reset by the end of the second post-COVID special. The boys go back in time, fix the future, and the friendship is restored. So the bad timeline isn't canon in the sense of being the permanent version of events. But the writers chose to imagine it. They chose to write it. And what they chose to imagine as the worst-case version of Stan and Kyle growing up was a version where the friendship didn't survive. That is arguably one of the most autobiographically loaded things South Park has ever done, and it sits there in the Paramount Plus library right now, waiting for people to notice what it actually is. There's another layer to all of this that tends to get less attention, and I want to mention it because I think it's important. The original voice actress for most of the female characters on the show, Wendy, Sharon Marsh, Leanne Cartman, Sheila Broflovsky, Principal Victoria, all of them, was a woman named Mary Kay Bergman. She voiced them from the beginning of the show through most of 1999. And in November of that year, she died by suicide. She was 38 years old. The show has never really publicly processed this. It couldn't, really. It was still a new show, and she had voiced characters that were integral to the cast, and the creators had to just keep going. Her roles got split up between Eliza Schneider for a few years, and then April Stewart and Mona Marshall from the mid-2000s onward, and the show just kept moving. There was no tribute episode, no on-screen acknowledgement. That's not a criticism. Sometimes the honest thing to do is to just keep working and let the grief live somewhere off camera. But I do think about it when I watch early episodes. The voices of Sharon Marsh and the other mums and the women of the town in those first 3 seasons are the voice of a woman who didn't live to see the show become what it became. There's a real-world sadness threaded through the early stuff that the early stuff itself has no way of acknowledging. So this is the autobiographical layer of South Park, and I think it's easy to forget once you're deep in the mythology. The boys are not just characters. Stan is, in some real sense, Trey Parker, thinking about what it would be like to grow up in his own hometown. Kyle is Matt Stone working out his moral positions at scale. Randy Marsh's chaos is, at least in part, what it looks like to observe your own dad's generation from the perspective of a son in his 50s. Sharon's exhaustion is probably a version of watching your own mum put up with things. The show is chaotic and crude and savage and mean. It is also, underneath all of that, a pair of creators who have been walking around inside their own childhoods year after year for a genuinely long time, making television out of it, which is a lovely thing to think about, actually. The people who made the show made it out of their own lives. That's more than I can say for most long-running television. And once you know that, the little weird details, the geologist's dad, the parents' names, the friendship at the center of it all, stop being trivia and start feeling more like a signature left at the bottom of a painting. Trey was here. Matt was here. This is what they remembered. This is what they made out of it. Now, keeping that in mind, that these boys are real in a certain sense to the people who made them, let's talk about the thing about them that is absolutely not real. The thing that the show has never explained, never acknowledged, and never even really tried to make consistent. The fact that these boys have been in the 4th grade for a very, very long time. Let me give you a number that the more you think about it becomes genuinely strange. The boys of South Park have been in the 4th grade since the year 2000, not since season 1. Season 1, they were in 3rd grade. They aged up once, exactly one time, in an episode from season 4 called 4th Grade. That episode aired in November of 2000, and they have been 4th graders ever since, for roughly a quarter of a century. Stan Marsh, the everyman who is based on Trey Parker, has celebrated the 4th grade for longer than many adult viewers have been alive. The episode where they aged up is actually worth talking about for a minute because it's a nice little piece of show history. 4th grade introduced Ms. Choksondik, who was their new teacher after Mr. Garrison got fired. The episode's whole plot is basically about the boys deciding the 4th grade's too hard and trying to go back to 3rd grade using a time machine built out of Timmy's wheelchair. There's a Star Trek nerd subplot. Kenny dies, as per usual for that era. And by the end of the episode, Ms. Choksondik tells the boys to stop trying to go backwards because life has new challenges in it, and the boys accept being in 4th grade. And they've stayed there, never moved up, never moved on. Now, in most animated shows, this isn't something you're supposed to think about. Bart Simpson has been 10 years old since 1989. Stewie Griffin has been a baby since 1999. There's a concept in animation called cartoon time, which is the unspoken agreement between the show and the audience that we will all pretend the characters age when the plot needs it and don't age when the plot doesn't need it. Everybody understands this. You don't interrogate why Bart is still 10. It's just how the genre works. But South Park does something that no other long-running animated show really does to the same extent. It aggressively references the real, passing calendar. Episodes are produced fast enough to comment on events that happened days earlier. Presidential elections happen on the show when they happen in reality. George W. Bush is president, then Obama is president, then Trump is president, then he is again. COVID happens. The pandemic specials are explicitly set during the pandemic and reference the pandemic by name. The boys attend school during lockdown. They wear masks. They watch the adults lose their minds over vaccines. Real time is happening around them, and they keep being 10 years old. This is the bit that the time loop theory is trying to make sense of. And before I get into it, I want to flag this with the honest hedge. Is this theory confirmed by the show? No. Has it been denied? Also no. And that's sort of what makes it fun to sit with. The writers have never said, here's how to understand the age freeze. They've never engaged with the question at all in universe, which means fans have filled in the gap with their own answers, and some of those answers are genuinely lovely. The time loop theory in its cleanest form goes like this. The same supernatural mechanism that keeps Kenny coming back from the dead is warping time around the entire town of South Park. Every time Kenny dies and resets, the town resets with him, bringing everyone back to roughly the same age they were when the cycle started. Real-world events still happen because the outside world isn't inside the time loop. But inside South Park itself, the clocks are stuck. The boys don't age because time isn't moving forward for them. It's moving in a very tight circle. This theory has some actual textual support, which is what makes it interesting. The show has confirmed, as we'll get into properly in a bit, that Kenny's immortality is a genuine supernatural curse linked to the cult of Cthulhu. If you accept that as the premise, then extending the curse's effects to the town around him isn't that much of a stretch. Cthulhu is, in Lovecraftian lore, the kind of entity whose very existence is meant to warp reality in the immediate area. A town sitting on top of a Kenny-shaped anomaly would plausibly experience time weirdly. That's the argument anyway. The counter-argument is much more mundane. The counter-argument is that Parker and Stone didn't want to deal with the storytelling complications of aging the characters, and so they didn't. And the reason we don't have a clean, in-universe explanation is because there isn't one. They just write the show. The boys stay the same age because Parker and Stone enjoy writing 10-year-olds and don't enjoy writing teenagers. The time freeze is an authorial decision, not a supernatural phenomenon. Which is probably what's actually going on, if we're being honest. But here's the thing that makes the fan theory actually hold up better than you'd expect, and this is the bit I find genuinely interesting. The show has exactly twice broken the age freeze and shown the boys as adults. And in both cases, the experience of watching them as grown-ups is so strange and so sad that you almost want the time freeze back by the end. The first time was in the original film Bigger, Longer, and Uncut from 1999, which doesn't really count because it's set during the same period as the show. The second and third times were the two post-COVID specials from 2021. Those specials jumped the boys 40 years into the future. They're in their 50s, Stan is a whiskey consultant, Kyle is some kind of wellness guru, Cartman has converted to Judaism and become a rabbi, married to a Jewish woman named Yentl with 2 kids. Kenny has become a brilliant scientist and has died, which is what brings everyone back to the town for his funeral. And sitting with these adult versions of the boys is genuinely uncomfortable. Stan is bitter. Kyle is obsessed with proving Cartman's conversion is a performance. Cartman, and this is the bit that surprised me, is visibly happy. Reformed, gentle with his children. The audience has spent 25 years watching him be cruel, and in the future, he's just a sweet dad. Kyle can't let it go. Stan can't let anything go. Kenny's dead. It's not a happy future. And then, at the end of the second special, the timeline resets. Everybody goes back to being 10. The alternate adult future gets erased, and you get the sense, watching it, that the show itself, meaning Parker and Stone, couldn't bear to leave them as adults. They needed to bring them back. Whether that's because the format requires it, or because the creators couldn't stomach it, or because aging the boys would mean actually ending the show, I don't know. But the emotional tilt of the post-COVID specials is being an adult is worse than being a kid in South Park, which is a weirdly tender thing for South Park to say out loud. So there's another softer fan theory that I quite like, which is that the boys don't age not because of a curse or a time loop, but because the show itself is protective of them. The age freeze is the show holding onto its characters. If you watch them grow up, they'd have to leave. They'd have to go to middle school and high school and get jobs and become versions of their parents. Better to let them stand at the bus stop forever, 10 years old, waiting for the bus that will never come. There's also the simplest reading, which is that South Park is a show about childhood, and the age freeze is what lets it keep being about childhood. The jokes and the satire land differently when they're coming out of the mouths of small children. If Cartman were 35, he wouldn't be darkly funny anymore. He'd just be a horrible man. The immaturity of the characters is what makes the show able to say the things it wants to say. Aging them would cost the show its voice. One more detail, because I think it's a nice one. There's a moment in the original 4th grade episode, the one where the boys age up, where Ms. Choxon Dick tells them something that I think the show is quietly telling itself. She says it's pointless to go back in time to relive the good moments because there are always new challenges to face. It's meant to be her convincing them to accept 4th grade, but you can also read it as the show telling the boys and telling the audience that moving forward is inevitable, that they'd have to eventually. And then they didn't. They stayed in 4th grade, and they're still in 4th grade now, 25 years later, which is kind of the joke. Ms. Choxondik gave them a speech about moving forward, and nobody moved forward. She then died, canonically, in season 6, which is either a coincidence or a quiet piece of symbolism about what happens to teachers who try to tell the boys of South Park anything meaningful. Either way, the boys are still 10, and they always will be more or less. Which brings us quite naturally to the kid in the orange parka, who has probably the most complicated relationship with always being 10 out of any of them. Because for Kenny McCormick, being 10 forever isn't just a cartoon convention. It's, as the show eventually reveals, a proper curse. If you watch South Park at any point between 1997 and the early 2000s, there's a particular sound that probably lives in your head whether you want it there or not. The sound of Stan saying, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny," followed by Kyle saying, "You bastards." That exchange happened in nearly every episode of the first 5 seasons. Almost every single week, Kenny McCormick would die in some ridiculous, often gruesome way, and those 2 lines would land, and the episode would move on. Nobody in the show ever treated it as anything other than normal. Nobody grieved. Nobody even particularly noticed by the next week when Kenny would just be back at the bus stop again, same parka, same muffled voice, Same smell of poverty and cigarette smoke hanging around him. For years, that was the entire bit. Kenny dies, everybody moves on. That was it. That was his defining character trait. He was the poor kid in the orange parka who died a lot. And for a long time, I think most viewers, including me, just accepted that as the joke. Because it was a joke, it was played that way. The deaths were always creative and absurd. He got hit by a truck, he got struck by lightning, he got impaled on the American flag in one episode. He got crushed by various things falling from the sky. He spontaneously combusted, he was eaten, he was shot, he exploded. The writers seemed to genuinely take pleasure in coming up with new ways to kill him, and the audience took genuine pleasure in watching it happen, and nobody was supposed to think about it beyond the laugh. But then, the show changed its mind. Not all at once. Gradually, over several seasons, the running gag started to curdle into something else. And the full reveal, when it came, was one of the sadder quiet turns the show ever did. The first big shift was in season 5, actually. In the episode Kenny Dies, which aired in 2001, the show killed Kenny for real. He died of muscular dystrophy, slowly, on screen, in a hospital bed, and then the show didn't bring him back for the rest of the season. Season 6 aired with no Kenny. Stan, Kyle, and Cartman had to find a new fourth friend, which is actually what creates the opening for Butters to become a main character, but we'll get to that. For most of season 6, Kenny was just gone. The bluegrass version of the theme song, the one that ran through season 6 to 10, had his lyrics reassigned to Timmy. Just Timmy's name over and over, where Kenny's muffled part used to be. Parker and Stone said at the time that they were sick of killing him every week and wanted to retire the character. I sort of believe that, and I also sort of don't. Because Kenny eventually came back, and when he came back, the show had decided to do something with him it had never done before. It had decided to take him seriously. The Mysterian arc started properly in season 13 in an episode called The Coon, and it expanded into the big 3-part Coon and Friends storyline in season 14. The setup is that the boys are all pretending to be superheroes. Cartman is the Coon, Stan is Toolshed, Kyle is the human kite. Fine, standard kid stuff. But then there's this fourth hero, Mysterian, who is clearly being played with a different level of seriousness than the others. The other boys' superhero personas are jokes. Mysterian's feels real. He speaks with a gravelly, deepened voice. He takes the job properly. He's clearly trying to be an actual hero. And then, a few episodes in, the show does a thing. Mysterian sits his friends down and tells them his superpower. His superpower is that he cannot die. He explains that he has been killed many times before, that he always wakes up in his bed the next morning completely fine, and that nobody ever remembers it happening. His friends don't believe him. They think he's exaggerating or making a bit. And so, to prove it, Kenny, standing right there in front of them, unmasked as Mysterian, pulls out a gun and shoots himself in the head. The scene is really, genuinely one of the most startling things the show has ever put on television. The other boys are screaming, they're crying, they're horrified. Cut to the next morning and Kenny's at school, alive, fine. And none of them remember what they saw, none of them. Not Stan, not Kyle, not Cartman. The memory is just gone, scrubbed from their heads overnight. And Mysterian, sitting there knowing exactly what happened, knowing he's the only one in the world who remembers any of his deaths, just keeps going. He can't say anything. Nobody would believe him. What the show is doing in that scene is turning 20 years of weekly gags into a portrait of genuine, lonely, horrifying isolation. Kenny has been dying over and over since 1997, and nobody, not his best friends, not his parents, not anyone in the town, has ever noticed. He suffers alone every time. He bears the memory of every single death. And when he tries to explain this, The only way he can get anyone to listen is to kill himself in front of them, knowing that by morning they'll have forgotten he ever did. And then the show goes even further, because if Kenny's curse is real, the next question is obviously where it came from. And the answer, when the show finally gives it, is absolutely absurd in a way that only South Park could pull off. In the Coon and Friends finale, Kenny, as Mysterion, confronts his parents. He asks them about something called the Cult of Cthulhu because the supernatural entity that's been causing chaos across that whole storyline, Cthulhu himself, is clearly connected somehow to Kenny's resurrection cycle. And Kenny's parents, caught out, admit what they did. Years ago, before Kenny was born, they attended a meeting of the local cult of Cthulhu. They joined. And when Kenny asks them why they would do that, their answer is that the cult was offering free beer. That's it. That's the origin of the curse. Kenny's parents joined a Lovecraftian death cult for the beer, and their son has been paying for it ever since, dying and being reborn over and over for more than 2 decades of showtime now. Forgotten every time, isolated in his own pain. Because at some point before he existed, his parents wanted a free drink. I want to sit with that for a second because I think it's genuinely one of the most South Park things the show has ever produced. It manages to be a proper horror premise and a completely absurd joke at the same time. The Lovecraft reference is real. The Cthulhu cult is drawn from actual Lovecraftian texts. There's a moment in the storyline where Kenny hears the cult members reciting a line that's straight out of the Necronomicon, the "that is not dead which can eternal lie" quote, which is a real piece of Lovecraft writing. The show is taking the mythology seriously, but it's grounding it in the most pathetically human, most appallingly believable motivation imaginable. Kenny's parents didn't sell their son to ancient gods for power. They sold him for a sixer. The final scene of the Coon and Friends arc is the one that properly broke me the first time I watched it. Kenny has died again. He's been reborn again. Nobody in his life has any memory of the events of the last few episodes. He's standing with his friends who are excitedly talking about how Mintberry Crunch, the fake superhero who turned out to have real powers, just saved the day. And Kenny, at the end of it, tells them he's tired and wants to go to bed, and then he shoots himself in the head in front of them again. Cut to his mother, jolting awake in labor, crying out that it's happening again. Cut to her placing baby Kenny in his tiny orange parka in his crib. And she turns to her husband and she says, "We never should have gone to that stupid cult meeting." That's the confirmation. That's the show telling you, flat out, that yes, this has happened hundreds of times, that Kenny's mother has been in labor hundreds of times, watching her son come back over and over, that the curse is genuinely real, that the parents know, that the cycle is endless, and that the show, for all its jokes and fart humor and celebrity parodies, is capable of writing something this genuinely sad when it wants to. One thing I want to add, because I think it's worth saying, is that after this reveal, Kenny's deaths in later seasons started happening less often. The show stopped killing him every week, and when he did die in later episodes, it felt heavier, more consequential. The writers couldn't treat it as a throwaway gag anymore because they'd told us what it actually was. Once you've shown the audience a kid who is trapped in a cycle of dying and being forgotten, you can't really go back to, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny" as the joke. It's not that kind of joke anymore. It never was, really. We just didn't know. I think that's the thing about Kenny that I keep coming back to when I think about the show. The curse isn't really the dying. The dying is the mechanism. The curse is the being forgotten. He dies, and the people who love him don't know it happened. He comes back, and nobody welcomes him back because nobody knew he was gone. His pain has no witnesses. That's the curse. That's what Cthulhu and the Necronomicon actually gave him. A life where nothing he goes through can ever be seen, and the parents went for free beer. Now, once you've accepted the premise that Kenny genuinely dies every time, not as a gag, but as an actual event inside the fiction of the show, some quite fun logistical questions start to surface. Questions that the show itself has never bothered to answer, but that fans have been happily answering on their own for about 20 years now. Most of them are lighter than what we just went through, which I think is appropriate. We could probably use a breather. My favorite one, and probably the best known of the lighter Kenny theories, goes like this. The McCormick family is extremely poor. This is established in the first episode and reinforced across basically every season of the show. They live in a house that looks like it's being held together by hope. They have no money, the parents drink, the fridge is always empty, poverty is, functionally, Kenny's whole family backstory. The theory is that they are poor because they have been paying for Kenny's funerals, all of them. Every week for years, every single time he dies, they bury him. Every single time they bury him, they pay for it. Caskets are expensive, funeral services are expensive, plots in a cemetery are expensive. Multiply that by roughly 100 deaths across seasons 1 through 5 alone, and you're looking at a level of ongoing funeral expenditure that would bankrupt a middle-class family, let alone a working-class one that was already struggling. Is this theory confirmed by the show? No. Has it been denied? Also no. The writers have never directly engaged with it. But the mechanical logic of it actually works. If Kenny's deaths are real events that his family witnesses, and if they then forget them the next day the way everyone else does, then presumably the financial aftermath would still be real even if the memory wasn't. Dead bodies don't stop being dead bodies just because you forget you dealt with one yesterday. Funeral homes don't refund their bills based on amnesia. There's a subtler version of the theory that goes further, which is that even though the conscious memory of Kenny's deaths gets wiped, the family is somehow trapped in a cycle of generating the costs anyway. Credit card bills they don't remember running up, debts to the funeral home that they can't account for, deep poverty that has no traceable cause because every time they'd go to account for it, the evidence of the expense has been erased. That's honestly more horrifying than the original theory, and I don't want to dwell on it, but it does explain quite a lot about why the McCormick parents seem permanently exhausted and permanently drunk. Another theory that I find genuinely charming is about the mother. You remember the final scene from the Coon and Friends arc where Mrs. McCormick is jolting awake in labor again? The implication there is that every time Kenny dies, she goes through childbirth again. She doesn't remember it, and neither does he, but it happens. The fan theory extension of this is that she has been in labor hundreds of times. Hundreds over the course of Kenny's life. Which means that from her body's perspective, if not her mind's, she has given birth to her son hundreds of times. That's just something to sit with. I don't have commentary on it beyond wow. Wow is the right response. The show has put the evidence for this right there in the finale, and we're just supposed to carry on watching, which I suppose we do. There's a theory about Kenny's parka itself that I want to mention, even though it has basically no canonical support. Some fans have argued that the orange parka is an actual magical item tied directly to Kenny's immortality. The idea is that the parka was given to his mother by someone connected to the cult, and that it's what contains or channels the resurrection magic, which is why the show always puts a fresh parka on the reborn baby Kenny in the finale scene. Is there anything in the show that supports this? Not really. The parka is just his parka. But I like it as a piece of fan speculation because it explains a production choice the show has made for decades. Kenny is basically never shown without the parka. His hood is basically always up. When he does take it down in the original film, it's a big dramatic moment. The parka has meaning, whether or not it's magical meaning. A related theory, though more meta than in-universe, concerns the muffled voice. Kenny's speech is notoriously hard to understand because of the hood. The technique the show uses is that Matt Stone records Kenny's lines normally, and then they're literally muffled in post-production. In the early seasons, this meant you could sometimes barely make out what he was saying. Modern episodes tend to mix the muffling a bit cleaner so the lines come through more. But for most of the show's history, Kenny's dialogue has been borderline unintelligible on purpose. The fan theory on this one isn't really a theory so much as an observation. Kenny speaks plenty, it's just that we, the audience, are being positioned as someone who doesn't hear him clearly. Like his friends, we don't really notice him. The muffling is the show mechanically doing to us what the forgetting does to his friends inside the fiction. We have to work to hear him. Most of the time, we don't bother. There's a darker theory that I want to flag and then move past quickly because I don't think we should sit with it for too long. Some fans have tried to connect the real-world deaths of people associated with the show, like Mary Kay Bergman, the original female voice actress who died in 1999, to the in-fiction Kenny curse, as if the show's magic somehow bled out into reality. I think this one isn't especially kind, and I don't think it holds up. Real people dying are not a fan theory. They're just sadness. The show has real-world tragedies behind it, like any long-running production, and I'd rather not loop those into the fictional mythology as if they were part of the same story. So I'll just mention it and move on. One last thing, and this one is just a nice piece of trivia. The actual lyrics Kenny sings in the theme song are, and have always been, extremely uncensored. They're rude in ways that would not fly if you could understand them. For most of the show's run, this hasn't been a problem because the parka muffles them into incomprehensibility. But when the show recut the intro into an orchestral version for season 25, they re-recorded his lyrics uncensored, and if you listen carefully to that version, you can actually make out what he's been saying under the hood all these years. It's not illuminating in any deep way. He's just been singing a fairly filthy verse about himself in a muffled voice since the 90s, and nobody knew, which is, again, on brand. Kenny has been saying things out loud for decades that nobody has been listening to. The muffling was never just a joke, it was the point. Right, I think that's enough Kenny for now. The poor kid has been through enough in this script already. There's plenty more to say about him. He's arguably the most theorized about character in the entire show. But I think it's time to turn our attention to the boy who is, if anything, a more complicated piece of lore than Kenny. Because while Kenny's mystery is mostly about what happens to him, the next one is about where somebody actually comes from. Specifically, where Eric Cartman came from, which is a question the show set up in 1998, refused to answer for 12 years, and then finally answered in an episode that is basically impossible to legally stream today. Right. Let me take you back to February 1998. South Park Season 1 is in its final episode. It's called Cartman's Mom is a Dirty Slut, which already tells you what kind of episode it is. The whole plot is that Eric Cartman has no idea who his father is, and his mother Liane doesn't seem to know either. So they trace back through her social calendar from roughly 9 months before Cartman was born, and it turns out she was extraordinarily popular during that period. The list of possible fathers includes basically every male character on the show, and a few who weren't even in town at the time. The episode builds to a big reveal. The town gathers at Jesus and Pals, the local public access talk show where the results of a paternity test are supposed to settle the matter once and for all, and then the episode ends on a cliffhanger. To be continued. Tune in later to find out who Cartman's dad is. This is the first proper cliffhanger the show ever did. It was a big deal at the time. People actually talked about it. There was a marketing campaign. Parker and Stone were hyping the reveal, except the reveal never happened. The follow-up episode, which opens season 2, is called Cartman's Mom is Still a Dirty Slut. And its entire joke is that the show deliberately refuses to deliver on the cliffhanger. Instead, the episode reveals that Cartman's mother is actually a hermaphrodite. She's his father as well as his mother. End of story, apparently. Case closed. The audience did not buy it, nobody bought it. It was very obviously a joke at the expense of viewers who had been eagerly waiting 6 months for the real answer. Parker and Stone have since said in commentary that they basically forgot the plot over the summer hiatus and had no idea what the real reveal was supposed to be. So they punted. They made up a silly answer and moved on, and the show went on without ever really resolving the question for 12 years. 12 years. That's how long the actual answer sat there, unaddressed. while the show kept making episodes around it. Cartman got plenty of episodes about his mother. His mother's promiscuity became an ongoing running gag, but nobody ever asked again properly who his real biological father was. The hermaphrodite answer was sort of allowed to stand, because what was the alternative? Writing a new paternity test episode in 2004 would have felt forced, so they just left it. And then, in 2010, they came back to it. And the episode they used to come back to it is genuinely, properly unhinged in the best way. It's called 200 because it's the 200th episode of the show. And it brings back basically every recurring character and running thread they could fit. A gigantic mecha Barbra Streisand is destroying the town. The super best friends, a team of religious figures including Jesus, Buddha, Krishna, and a few others, are trying to stop her. The Gingers are holding the town hostage to force a revelation about the prophet Muhammad. Tom Cruise is crying about being mocked. And in the middle of all of this, Cartman is pursuing the one thing he's been after, subconsciously or not, since 1998. He wants to know who his father is. The reveal, when it finally comes in the follow-up episode 201, is a proper piece of 12 years in the making plotting. Scott Tenorman, Cartman's oldest and most hated enemy from the show, returns. He has spent years in a mental institution researching Cartman's family history. And he reveals that Cartman's biological father was a former Denver Bronco named Jack Tenorman, Scott's father, which makes Scott and Cartman half-brothers. Now, this is already a lot, but the horror of the reveal is that it recontextualizes retroactively one of the most notorious episodes in the entire show. If you've seen South Park, you have probably heard of Scott Tenorman Must Die. It's the season 5 episode from 2001 that's widely considered the defining dark Cartman moment of the entire series. The plot, briefly, is that Scott Tenorman, who is a few years older than the boys, scams Cartman out of some money and humiliates him about it. Cartman, unable to accept the humiliation, spends the episode plotting increasingly elaborate revenge schemes. At the climax of the episode, at a chili cook-off, Cartman reveals his actual plan. He has arranged for Scott's parents to be shot and killed by a farmer, their bodies ground up, and cooked into the chili that Scott is now eating. He has tricked his enemy into eating his own dead parents. And he then stands there in front of everyone and eats Scott's tears of horror with a spoon. The episode is regularly cited as the moment the audience realized Cartman wasn't just a comically mean kid, he was something genuinely much darker than that. So that was 2001. That's where the show had parked Cartman's character ceiling, a 9-year-old capable of orchestrating the murder of a classmate's parents and making him eat them. For 9 years, that was the reading. Then, in 2010, the reveal in 201 drops the retroactive bomb. Jack Tenorman, the father Cartman had killed and fed to Scott, was Cartman's own biological father. Cartman killed his own dad, unwittingly. He fed his father to his half-brother. The chili cook-off was not just revenge on a bully, it was accidentally a case of fratricide by proxy and patricide, by a boy who had no idea he was doing either. The show plays this for a proper horror beat. Cartman, being told this, reacts in a way that is absolutely on brand for him and also genuinely dark. He does cry, but he doesn't cry about killing his father. He cries about the implication that he is half ginger, because Jack Tenorman was a redhead, and Cartman has spent his entire life being aggressively racist toward gingers. The horror of patricide doesn't land with him. The social humiliation of having ginger blood does. His half-brother then tries to console him by pointing out that he's also half Denver Bronco, which somehow cheers him up. And the show moves on. There's something so specifically cruel about the writer's choice to have Cartman be distressed by the wrong thing. He doesn't grieve his father. He doesn't sit with the fact that he just found out he murdered one of his own parents. He's upset about his hair. That's the character. That's who Cartman is. And the reveal is, among everything else it's doing, a character beat about exactly how incapable he is of processing moral weight. Now here's the part of this story that I find almost unbearably ironic. The episodes that contain this reveal, 200 and 201, are two of the most important episodes in the entire show's mythology. They resolve the longest-running mystery in South Park history. They retroactively transform one of the show's most famous episodes into something darker. They're arguably essential viewing if you want to understand the Cartman character, and you can't legally stream them basically anywhere. Because the same episodes that reveal Cartman's father also contain depictions and discussion of the Prophet Muhammad, which triggered genuine death threats against Parker and Stone from an extremist group at the time. Comedy Central heavily censored the original broadcast of 201, bleeping out not only Muhammad's name but also a speech at the end of the episode that had nothing to do with Muhammad. Parker and Stone were furious about it. They said so publicly. And since then, these two episodes, along with a few others that touch on Muhammad, Super Best Friends from Season 5, and the two-part Cartoon Wars from Season 10, have been quietly removed from most major streaming platforms. They're not on Paramount Plus. They weren't on HBO Max when the show was there. They're not on Hulu. They exist technically on DVD. And scrappy copies float around online, but for the vast majority of casual viewers, they may as well not exist, which means the single most important piece of South Park mythology, the answer to a question the show set up in 1998, is effectively hidden from most people watching the show today. If you started watching South Park through Paramount Plus in 2025, you would never see the episodes that resolve Cartman's paternity. You would in fact probably have no idea the mystery was ever resolved. You might vaguely remember hearing something about a chili cook-off. You might know Cartman has a half-brother somehow. But the actual reveal, the actual canon answer to the longest-running plot thread in the show's history is sitting inside episodes you can't legally watch. There's something appropriately South Park about that, I think. The show's most important reveal got banned for reasons having nothing to do with the reveal itself. The mythology got buried because of the geopolitics of the episode it happened to be inside. Most fans don't even know the answer exists. Cartman fed his own father to his half-brother, and the show told us about it, and then the show took the telling away. I think there's a version of this whole thing where the show accidentally did exactly what Cartman would have wanted. He would have preferred, I suspect, that nobody ever know where he came from. He'd rather be the monster with the mysterious backstory than the half-ginger with the Denver Broncos bloodline. And by complete accident, the show hid his backstory exactly the way he would have hidden it himself if he'd been in charge. The universe, or the writers, or the Prophet Muhammad controversy, or some combination of all three, gave Eric Cartman the obscure origin story he probably wanted, which, now that I've told you about it, is a good bridge to the thing that a lot of longtime viewers have been quietly thinking for a long time, which is that Cartman isn't just a character in the show. He might, depending on how you read the evidence, be the actual villain of the whole thing. And there's a fan theory about that. Let's get into it. Here's a statistic I find hard to hold in my head, even though I've looked at the numbers. Eric Cartman has a higher confirmed body count across the run of South Park than Satan does, higher than the Antichrist, higher than any single antagonist the show has ever introduced. A fourth-grade boy from a small mountain town has, across a properly long run of television, killed, caused the deaths of, or directly engineered the destruction of more people than the actual Lord of Hell. Which raises a question that fans have been circling for a very long time. What if the show isn't a show about 4 friends who have one extremely problematic mate? What if it's actually a show about 3 kids who have, for mysterious reasons that are never quite explained, decided to stay close friends with the villain? This is the Cartman is the big bad theory. And like most of the fan theories we're going to cover tonight, I want to flag it properly. Is this theory confirmed by the writers? No. Has it been denied? Also no. The show is structurally a comedy, and it treats Cartman as a main character rather than an antagonist. But the evidence that fans marshal for this reading is substantial, and once you start seeing the show through this lens, it's a bit hard to unsee. Let me walk through what the theory actually claims. The argument is that Cartman is essentially a developing psychopath in miniature. The show has repeatedly depicted him committing acts that, if committed by an adult, would be considered some of the worst crimes a human being can commit. We've already talked about the Scott Tenorman Chili incident, which was essentially a contract killing of 2 innocent parents plus a cannibalism by proxy of their son. That's the signature Cartman crime, the defining moment of who he is. But it's not isolated. It's one data point in a pattern. The pattern includes, off the top of my head, the following: repeatedly threatening Jews with genocide in a way that the show plays for discomfort rather than laughs. Framing an innocent classmate for a crime against humanity in one of the early seasons. Orchestrating the murder of Kenny's hamster because Kenny wouldn't share a video game. Giving Butters what he calls the Hitler Yars, which is drawing a Hitler mustache on him with marker while he sleeps. As a running gag that the audience is supposed to find funny, but which, when you think about it, is sustained bullying of a friend who cannot defend himself. Trying to have Kyle killed in at least 2 different schemes that got abandoned before they were fully executed. Attempting to take over the planet on multiple occasions through various shell companies and fake organizations. And the theory adds that the foreshadowing for all of this was actually there from very early in the show. In the season 1 episode, Damien, the Antichrist himself, shows up in town, and the boys have to deal with him. The interesting thing about that episode is that Damien, the literal son of Satan, comes to Earth and starts off by getting bullied. He's an outcast at school. And the boys end up, in a weird way, being more cruel to Damien than Damien is to anyone else. Cartman, in particular, is vicious to him. The theory reading of that episode is that it's the show quietly suggesting Cartman is more fundamentally dangerous than the Antichrist. The son of Satan shows up, and the scariest kid in the room is still Cartman. There's another dimension to the theory, which is about why Stan and Kyle specifically keep him around. Kyle in particular. Kyle has had more reasons to cut Cartman out of his life than any other character in any animated show I can think of. Cartman is openly anti-Semitic to him. Cartman has tried to hurt him repeatedly in both direct and elaborate ways. Cartman's existence is genuinely a source of ongoing misery for Kyle. And yet Kyle keeps showing up every episode at the bus stop, carrying on. The Rancor version of this theory offers an interesting explanation. The argument is that Cartman is irritatingly often correct about things that nobody else is willing to entertain. He is usually wrong loudly about the wrong things, but every so often he's right, and being right saves the day. There's an episode called Mystery of the Urinal Deuce from season 10, where Cartman launches into a 9/11 conspiracy theory, and for most of the episode it seems like he's just doing his usual paranoid nonsense. The other boys dismiss him, and then, in classic South Park fashion, the episode eventually reveals that part of what Cartman was saying happens to be closer to a weird truth than anyone expected. Not the part about Kyle being responsible, obviously. That was pure Cartman being Cartman. But the conspiracy-shaped part. The show keeps doing this. Cartman says something outlandish, everyone dismisses him, and then the episode works out in a way that slightly vindicates his paranoia. The theory suggests that the boys keep Cartman around because Cartman, for all his moral failures, sometimes sees things the rest of them don't. His complete lack of social filter, combined with his relentless self-interest, means he notices power dynamics and weaknesses that more well-adjusted kids miss. He is, in a sick way, useful, which is a quietly horrifying thing for a kid's friend group to be based on. There's a darker variant of the theory, which I find harder to fully embrace, but which is worth mentioning. The variant goes that Cartman represents the ID. He is the voice of every impulse that the rest of the boys have been socialized to suppress. Stan is the ego, the reasonable, integrated self. Kyle is the superego, the moral voice, the conscience, the one who argues for doing the right thing. Kenny is, in this reading, mortality itself, the constant reminder of consequences. And Cartman is the ID, the raw, unfiltered impulse, the part of every kid that wants to eat the whole bag of sweets and scream at their mother when they're told no. If you accept that framing, the show becomes a sort of psychological portrait of a single person's inner life split across 4 characters, which is an ambitious reading for a show about fart jokes and celebrity parodies, but it's not, I don't think, an unfair one. Parker and Stone are genuinely sophisticated writers who happen to hide their sophistication behind crudeness. The 4 Boys as Psychological Components reading has been around since the early 2000s, and it doesn't really contradict anything the show has done. It just sits alongside the show as a possible way to read it. The show itself has had some interesting responses to the question of whether Cartman is redeemable, especially in the last decade or so. The post-COVID specials that we touched on earlier take a really unexpected position on this. In the future timeline of those specials, adult Cartman has converted to Judaism, married a Jewish woman named Yentl, had 2 children, and become a rabbi in Colorado Springs. He appears genuinely to have grown into a kind, gentle, present father. He is softer than he has ever been. His voice is lower. He smiles warmly at his kids. He hugs them as he leaves, and the show lingers on the hug for a beat. Kyle, sitting across the room, cannot accept that this is real. He's convinced Cartman is performing, that the whole Rabbi Dad routine is an elaborate troll designed specifically to upset him. 40 years later, Kyle is still unable to let Cartman just be a person, which is, the show is clearly suggesting, Kyle's problem more than Cartman's at that point. Now, the thing about the post-COVID specials is that the timeline gets reset at the end. So this version of adult Cartman isn't technically canon in the permanent sense. It's a future that got erased. But it's the future the writers chose to imagine. When Parker and Stone asked themselves, what's the most interesting thing we could do with the grown-up version of this character? Their answer was, make him a good man and see how the others react. That's a fascinating creative choice, and it puts a ceiling on how far the Cartman is the big bad reading can go. The creators, when given a chance to write adult Cartman, wrote him as redeemable, which means they don't think he's irredeemable, even if the character is capable of horrifying things in the moment. The other thing the post-COVID specials do is gently suggest that the Kyle-Cartman dynamic is a two-way street. Kyle, the good one, the moral one, the conscience of the group, is in the future the one who cannot move on. Kyle is the one still nursing the grudge. Kyle is the one whose life has stalled, in part around hating Cartman. And Cartman, meanwhile, has moved on. Whether that's because Cartman is better at moving on, or because his inability to sit with his own actions makes moving on easy for him, is a question the specials leave open. But it's not a simple, Cartman is the villain framing anymore. It's more complicated than that. I think honestly, the best version of the theory is the softest one. Cartman isn't the big bad in the sense of being a supervillain the others have to defeat. He's the big bad in the sense of being the locus of moral danger in the show. The character through whom the writers explore what happens when a child is never held accountable, never corrected, and never really loved properly. His mother gives him everything he wants. His father doesn't exist in his life. The adults around him are spineless, and the kids around him, for their own reasons, keep him close. He's what happens when nobody stops the behavior early. And the show, by refusing to stop the behavior on screen either, makes us complicit in watching him become whatever he's becoming, which now that I've said it out loud is probably too heavy a note for a sleep video. Let me lighten the mood. There is another kid in South Park whose story is sad in a completely different way, and whose dark side has less to do with moral danger and more to do with being thoroughly, relentlessly ignored. And unlike Cartman, this kid is actually sweet, which is what makes his story genuinely heartbreaking. Picture, for a moment, a boy sitting on a bed in a small, neat bedroom. The walls are a bit too plain. The bed is made properly because his mother would be cross if it wasn't. He is wearing a small blue jumper and a serious expression. He has been told, for reasons he does not fully understand, that he is grounded. He has not been allowed to leave his room for 3 days. He is turning in small circles around the room, muttering to himself, holding imaginary conversations with imaginary versions of the people who have put him here. And he is, maybe, the only kid in South Park who has never done anything properly wrong. This is Leopold Stotch, known to everyone as Butters, and I think he is quietly one of the most tragic characters in modern television. Butters was originally a background kid. He appeared from the very beginning of the show, hovering in the class scenes, never really saying much. His character wasn't fleshed out until Kenny got killed off at the end of season 5, and the boys needed a 4th friend. Butters got upgraded to main cast status more or less by default, as the kid available to fill the hole. And for most of season 6, he was the 4th friend, sweet and eager and a bit out of his depth, trying his best to keep up with Stan and Kyle and Cartman. And then in an episode called Professor Chaos, which aired on the 10th of April, 2002, the boys fired him. That's the word the show uses. They fired him. They held a reality TV-style competition to find a better replacement, with the other kids in the class auditioning to be the new Kenny. Butters sat there watching this competition happen and was told to his face that he wasn't good enough to be their friend. He was too lame. He was too weird. They didn't want him anymore. The episode is played for comedy, as you'd expect. The boys' rejection of Butters is cruel, and it's funny at the same time. But Butters' reaction is the bit I want to focus on. He goes home, he sits in his room, and something inside him very quietly cracks. He decides, with the specific logic that only a lonely, rejected child could produce, that if he cannot be a hero, he will be a villain. He dons a hat made of tinfoil. He drapes a green cape over his shoulders. He gives himself a new name, Professor Chaos, and he sets out to destroy the world. What's genuinely funny about Professor Chaos is that he is, as a supervillain, absolutely terrible at it. His first evil act is switching 2 people's soup orders at a restaurant, which he considers an enormous stroke of malevolence. He tries to flood the world by pointing a garden hose at the sky. He tries to destroy the ozone layer by spraying aerosol cans in the air. He is the most ineffective supervillain in television history, and the show plays that for all the laughs it's worth. But underneath the comedy, the character is really clearly saying something. The pattern is this: a child is rejected by his friends. The child cannot process the rejection, so the child invents a role he can play, a theatrical identity he can slip into, where being bad is a way of being somebody. Professor Chaos is an expression of Butters' pain, but it's also a survival mechanism. It's him saying, I would rather be a villain than be nothing, because if I'm a villain, at least someone will notice me. And underneath all of that, there's the other, quieter thing about Butters, the home life thing. Butters lives with Stephen and Linda Stotch, who are, to put it mildly, not good parents. Butters is grounded in basically every episode he appears in for basically no reason. His parents seem to use grounding as a default discipline for anything he does or says that mildly inconveniences them. There are episodes where Butters is grounded for things he did not do. Episodes where he's grounded as a preventative measure. Episodes where he's grounded because his father had a bad day at work. The grounding is, in the show, played as a joke. But if you line up the episodes, the pattern is not a joke. It's child abuse, just rendered through the medium of cartoon comedy. Stephen and Linda are, in concrete terms, emotionally abusive parents. There's an episode called Butters' Very Own Episode where they, after believing he has died, spend most of the runtime performing their grief as if he had always been a burden on them. There's a Pet Sematary parody where his father actually digs up his body and reburies it in a cursed Indian burial ground to try to bring him back. And the real Butters is just meanwhile at a slumber party dressed as a girl. There's a moment in that same episode where they lock him in the basement and kill a saleswoman and leave her body for him to eat, because they have convinced themselves he's come back as a demon. That is frankly one of the most disturbing things the show has ever done, and it's played again as a cartoon. So Butters grows up in a house where his existence is treated as a low-grade inconvenience, where he's grounded for breathing in the wrong tone, and where his parents will, if the situation calls for it, literally try to feed him a corpse. And he goes to school and tries his best to be liked. He is generally cheerful. He is generally kind. He is generally hopeful. And the writers, across 20-plus years of storylines, have been steadily building a portrait of what that amount of unkindness does to a person who insists on staying kind. Now, this brings us to the post-COVID reveal, which I think is one of the genuinely clever pieces of plot weaving the show has ever done. Like we talked about earlier, the post-COVID specials jump the boys 40 years into the future. It's a funeral for Kenny, which has brought everyone back to South Park. And throughout the first special, there is an unseen character referenced as a kind of background threat, a mysterious imprisoned man called Victor Chaos. His name, through most of the special, is pronounced Victor Chaws. And you watch the whole thing assuming Victor Chaws is some new character, some new grown-up villain they've added to the adult version of South Park. At the very end of the special, the show does something sneaky. The camera lingers briefly on the door of his prison cell. On the door is a placard with his prisoner number. The number is 41002-66. Read that number back out to yourself. 41002-66, April 10th, 2002, the day the Professor Chaos episode first aired. Season 6, Episode 6. Victor Chaos is Butters. Victor Chaws isn't a new character. It's his name spelled the way it's always been spelled. The show just pronounced it weirdly to keep the reveal hidden. In the adult future of South Park, the sweet kid who used to tinfoil a mask to his face and cape himself up in his bedroom became, actually, the villain he always played at being. The role consumed the person. Butters, in the dark timeline, crossed over and ended up behind bars. Not redeemed, not rescued, not saved, just imprisoned. It is genuinely one of the saddest reveals in the entire run of the show, because what it tells you is that the Professor Chaos persona, which the show treated as comedy for 20 years, was not comedy. It was a diagnosis. The writers knew from 2002 onwards where this boy was heading if nobody intervened in his life. And they waited 19 years to show you, and when they showed you, they did it so quietly that most viewers missed it entirely. Victor Chaws, the placard said, and you had to be paying attention and know the air date of a Season 6 episode by heart to understand what had happened to a boy you liked. The timeline, as we mentioned, gets reset at the end of the second post-COVID special. Butters as Victor Chaos doesn't have to become real. But it's a future the writers chose to imagine, and they chose to imagine the worst case for Butters as the direction the boy was actually pointed towards if nothing changed, which raises the hard question that most long-running character studies eventually raise. If the writers can see where the character is going, and if the characters around him do not intervene, is the show responsible for what happens? The answer, obviously, is no. Butters is a cartoon. He can't be rescued from anything because he doesn't exist. But the question lands anyway because the show has been so careful to make him feel real. His happiness feels real, his pain feels real, his loneliness feels real. And the fact that, as of the most recent seasons, he is still being grounded for nothing, still being rejected by his friends, still being failed by his parents. All of that means the trajectory hasn't changed. Whatever Butters is heading toward, in the real, ongoing timeline, he is still heading toward it. The show hasn't saved him, it has only hinted at what it would take to save him, and then moved on. There's a genuine fan theory about Butters that I want to mention, because I think it's the kindest one. The theory is that Butters is actually the protagonist of the later seasons, not Stan, not Cartman, not Randy, Butters. The argument is that his arc, from background kid to rejected friend to ineffective villain to reluctant Cartman accomplice to quiet moral center whenever the show needs one, is the most coherent arc in the show. He is the character who changes most across the run. He is the character whose emotional beats are most carefully paid off. And he is, crucially, the character the show clearly loves most. If you watch the show with that reading in mind, Butters' episodes become quietly beautiful. The writers are being gentle with him, even when the plot is being cruel. They are holding him up patiently, season after season, showing you how a decent kid tries to navigate a world that will not let him be decent without punishing him for it. And when occasionally an episode ends with Butters being happy or accepted or safe for a moment, those endings carry real weight, because the show has earned them painfully across decades of watching him not get what he deserves. Butters deserves better. That's maybe the most honest thing I can say about him. Butters deserves better than his parents, better than his friends, better than the writers, and better than the dark timeline that the post-COVID specials glimpse. The fact that the show knows this and keeps loving him anyway is one of the strange, tender things that makes South Park feel at its best, like more than the sum of its fart jokes, which is a good moment to step back from the kids for a bit and look at the town itself. Because the question of why any of this is happening in the first place, why Butters is failing, why Cartman is rampaging, why Kenny keeps dying, why none of them can age, eventually circles back to a bigger question. Why this town? Why South Park? And there's a cluster of fan theories about that, which honestly take the show in genuinely supernatural directions. If you've watched enough South Park, you will have noticed a running gag that shows up now and then, usually when the plot needs a supernatural get-out. Someone will mention offhandedly that they buried something or somebody in an old Indian burial ground, or that the town is built on top of one, or that the specific piece of land where something terrible is about to happen is on or near one. It's a small, recurring detail that the show treats as a joke, but the joke depends on you noticing that the show keeps returning to the same idea. The town of South Park is built on top of something. There are at least 3 episodes that explicitly reference this. In Butters' very own episode, which we touched on earlier, there's a farmer character who looks exactly like Judd Crandall from the Stephen King novel Pet Sematary. In Aspen, the skiing episode, an old mechanic tells Stan that the mountain they're about to race on is the burial ground of a tribe he calls the Vampire Wichita Indians, who ate the flesh of eyeless children. Just, A casual aside, in Margarine the Gender Swap episode, that same Judd Crandall farmer reappears to warn Butters' father not to bury his son in the old Indian burial ground, which of course Steven does anyway because this is South Park and of course he does. So there's a running premise deliberately sprinkled across the show that the land around South Park is cursed or at least supernaturally contaminated by the history of who and what has been buried on it. And the fan theory extension of this is pretty simple. Every weird thing that happens in the town is ultimately downstream of that curse. Is this theory confirmed by the show? No. Has it been denied? Also no. The writers have never sat down and said, actually, all of it is the burial ground's fault. The theory is assembled from hints, running gags, and the observation that an awful lot of properly supernatural things keep happening in this one specific place. Let me just run through for a moment what has actually happened in South Park across the run of the show. This is a partial list. A volcano erupted. Aliens have landed multiple times, both friendly and otherwise. A literal Make-a-Streisand destroyed the town. The woodland creatures formed a satanic cult. The gates of hell opened in the town at least twice that I can remember. Satan himself moved into the area and had a complicated relationship with Saddam Hussein, both of whom ended up in the local afterlife infrastructure. Jesus lived there for a while, running a public access talk show. Barbra Streisand came back multiple times in different forms. The climate change monster Man-Bear Pig is canonically real and canonically murdered Satan in season 22. A cult worshipping Cthulhu, as we covered earlier, exists there. There are pirate ghosts. There are crab people. There are the underpants gnomes. There are, at least once, talking towels. Most towns do not experience this much weekly paranormal activity, Most towns do not have Cthulhu on a first-name basis. The theory suggests that the reason South Park specifically is the site of all this is that the town is built on or near some kind of supernatural vortex. The burial ground gag is a hint at it, but not the whole thing. The argument is that the land itself is thin, in the sense that ghost stories use that word. A thin place where the veil between this world and whatever else is out there is more porous than normal. There's a variant of this theory that I quite like, which points out that the town is explicitly located at an unusually high elevation in the Colorado Rockies, around 8,000 feet. Mountain towns, in folklore traditions around the world, tend to be coded as places where strange things happen. High altitude, thin air, isolation from the wider culture, long winters. These are the conditions under which people have historically developed vivid beliefs about what's out there in the woods. The theory suggests South Park is a cartoon distillation of that kind of setting. Not quite a Twin Peaks, but in the same mountain town with a secret genre. The show is playing, whether it means to or not, in a tradition of American small-town weirdness. There's a much bigger, much sillier theory that I want to cover next because it's one of the most popular fan theories about the show, and I think it deserves an airing even though it has basically no canonical support. This is the Illuminati test ground theory. The basic idea is that a secret organization, which the theory usually names as the Illuminati, though it doesn't really matter who specifically, is using the town of South Park as a testing ground for experiments that will later be unleashed on the rest of the world. New technologies, new social experiments, new strange phenomena. Everything gets tested on South Park first, and then, if it works, it gets rolled out wider. The argument is mostly observational. The town is small, isolated, and strangely resilient. Things happen there that would destroy any other community, and the residents just go back to normal by the end of the episode. If you were running experiments on a test population, you'd want exactly those conditions. Low visibility, strong reset capability, a population that doesn't seem to remember what happens to them. That is, not coincidentally, the same reset capability that Kenny has, which means the Illuminati test ground theory and the Kenny curse theory are doing similar explanatory work from different directions. Either Kenny's magic is blanketing the town, or someone external is engineering the memory wipes. The Illuminati theory has, I want to stress, essentially zero textual support. The show has not dropped any hints about a real-world organization running the town as an experiment. But the theory persists because it fits the observable facts, and because, in the kind of satirical universe South Park is set in, the idea of a shadowy cabal testing things on a small Colorado town is both funny and slightly plausible. This is, after all, the show that has had Tom Cruise locked in a closet, Scientology depicted as a pyramid scheme, and multiple episodes implying that the US government is, broadly speaking, up to no good. A secret organization running the town as a test lab is just slightly further down the same hallway of suspicion. There's another theory that I think actually fits the evidence better than the Illuminati one, and it's the gateway town theory. The argument here is that South Park is a thin place in a very specific way. It's a meeting point. Multiple realms that shouldn't normally intersect all have entrances or exits located in or near the town. Hell has an entrance there. We've seen people go down there and come back. Heaven has been reached from there, most notably in the original film. Imagination Land, the realm of fictional characters, is accessible from there. The Cult of Cthulhu has a chapter there because something about the geography allows contact with the Lovecraftian entities. The Man-Bear-Pig dimension, or whatever it was Man-Bear-Pig came from, apparently has an overlap with South Park territory. Most of this is played for comedy, but if you stack it up, the pattern is remarkable. Of all the places in America where you might expect the boundary between dimensions to be thin, South Park would have to be near the top of the list. That's a lot of portals for one small town. And the gateway theory argues that this is not a coincidence. The town exists geographically on a spot where multiple dimensional boundaries converge. The burial ground is one of the reasons the boundaries are thin. The cult of Cthulhu found the town for that reason. The boys keep having adventures in other realms because those realms are literally next door. The counter to all of this is, of course, the most boring and probably most accurate reading, which is that South Park isn't cursed. It's a cartoon. The reason weird things happen there is that the writers like writing weird things, and they have to happen somewhere. And a small, isolated Colorado town is a good enough container to put them in. If the show had been set in Manhattan, the weird things would have been in Manhattan. The location isn't mystically relevant. The location is whatever the writers chose, and the writers chose fair play because Trey Parker grew up nearby. And the weirdness is just the show being the show. But here's the thing that I find charming about this, and the reason I keep coming back to the cursed town theories, even though the satirical reading is almost certainly correct. The show has, over 28 seasons, never denied the supernatural. Not once. Every single weird thing that has happened on South Park has been treated as having actually happened within the fiction. The cult of Cthulhu is canonically real. Man-Bear-Pig is canonically real. Satan genuinely lives in hell and genuinely sometimes comes up for a visit. The town has genuinely been destroyed by Mecha Streisand and then genuinely been rebuilt. When the show does supernatural, it commits. Nothing gets hand-waved away at the end as, oh, it was all a dream. So if you take the show at its word, the supernatural reading is the canonical reading. The town really is the kind of place where Cthulhu has a chapter and hell has an entrance. And the fan theories about why that is, the burial ground, the vortex, the gateway, are all trying to explain something the show insists is actually happening. The satirical reading says it's just comedy. The in-universe reading says it's a town with a genuinely haunted geography. The show allows both, and sometimes it's nice just to sit with both at the same time. One more thought on this, because I think it's a nice place to land. If the town really is cursed, then the boys being trapped there, unable to age, unable to leave, unable to move on, starts to read as a sort of generational sentence. They didn't ask to be born in a gateway town built on a burial ground with a Cthulhu cult in the basement. They just were, and their lives, their weirdness, their endless repeating cycle of fourth-grade adventures is them serving out a sentence their ancestors imposed by choosing to settle on the wrong bit of land. That's not a happy reading, but it's a reading that makes a certain amount of sad, lovely sense if you've been watching the show long enough to see the pattern, which naturally pulls us toward the opposite direction. The reading where none of this is real in any supernatural sense, where the town isn't cursed, where Kenny isn't immortal, and where everything we've been watching is actually just what the world looks like through the eyes of the people inside it. Which is, if I'm honest, one of my favorite fan theories, because it's the one that makes the show almost unbearably bittersweet. Have you ever listened to a real 8-year-old describe something that happened to them? Not a written account, not a reported story, just a kid, actually 8 years old, telling you a story about something that actually happened that day. It usually sounds completely unhinged. A lot happened, everyone reacted enormously. There were explosions, or things that felt like explosions. Somebody did something that was objectively a crime against humanity. Somebody else said something that ruined lives forever. The kid is very certain about all of this. It is all, the kid insists, extremely important, and by the time the parents compare notes with the school, what actually happened turns out to be, more or less, that a pencil got broken. Now hold that in your head, and then watch a South Park episode, and then notice how much of what you're watching suddenly makes a different kind of sense. The theory I want to walk you through in this section is, broadly, the theory that South Park is not actually a supernatural show at all. It's a kid's show, by which I mean it's a show filtered through a child's perspective of what the world is like. The adults are idiots because to actual children, adults often look like idiots. The crises are apocalyptic because to actual children, losing a toy is apocalyptic. The boys are always at the center of everything because to actual children, they are always at the center of everything. Kenny dying is an exaggerated version of Kenny getting hurt, and then being fine the next morning, the way kids get hurt and are fine the next morning. The whole show in this reading is the world as it looks from a few feet off the ground. This theory has some actual support inside the show, which I think is important to mention. There have been episodes that explicitly reveal that what we've been watching is, in fact, the product of a kid's imagination. The most famous one is Woodland Critter Christmas from Season 8, which is a pitch-black satanic parody of a classic Christmas special. The whole episode is narrated in anapestic rhyme, like a children's storybook. Stan meets talking woodland animals in the forest who turn out to be Satanists. Kyle gets possessed by the Antichrist. Santa Claus shows up with a shotgun and murders everyone. It's very funny and is very disturbing, and about halfway through the episode, the tone has escalated to the point where you're wondering what on earth you're watching. And then, in the final minute, the show cuts to Mr. Garrison's 4th grade classroom. Everything we just watched, it turns out, was a Christmas story Cartman was reading aloud to the class. The Woodland Critter Satanists are not real. The possession is not real. Santa Claus with a shotgun is not real. It was a story inside Cartman's head. He made it up. And the class reacts to it in the way kids react to a classmate who spent too much time with Freddy Krueger, with a sort of uneasy, impressed horror. So the show has, at least once, properly committed to the bit of saying, what you were watching was a kid's made-up story. Which means the theory that more of the show is happening inside the boys' heads isn't completely untethered from canon. There's precedent, and once you start looking, the precedent might be bigger than you think. Think about the superhero arc, the Coon and Friends storyline that gave us the Kenny curse reveal. At the surface level, that arc involves actual supernatural events. Cthulhu actually appears, Bradley Biggle is actually a Mintberry Crunch alien. The powers seem to be real. But if you watch those episodes with the It's All a Kid's Game reading, they work just as well. The boys are playing superheroes in the backyard. Cartman is wearing a raccoon suit. Kenny is wearing a cape. They are narrating their own adventures to themselves. And what the show depicts as real events in the town might, in this reading, just be what the game feels like from the inside. Kids playing pretend to kids feels as real as anything. The Stick of Truth style medieval fantasy game the boys play across multiple episodes and into a video game works the same way. The show depicts it as genuinely epic, vast armies, dark magic, sieges, but it's, a bunch of children hitting each other with foam swords in somebody's garden. The grandeur is in their heads. The show is generously rendering the grandeur for us so we can see the game the way the boys are seeing it. But the underlying events are, if you strip away the presentation, pretty mundane, which leads naturally to the big version of this theory, the Kenny in a coma theory. I want to treat this one carefully because it's a well-known fan theory and it's been covered widely, but it's also the kind of theory that some viewers find uncomfortable because it implies a real-world trauma under the show's weirdness. So I'll frame it gently. The theory goes like this. Kenny, in the theory, is actually in a coma. Somewhere, in a real-world hospital, a real-world Kenny McCormick is lying in a bed, unconscious, after some accident or illness that nearly killed him. And the entire show, or at least a large portion of it, is the inside of his coma. His friends are there because he misses them. His family's there because he needs them, in the way a sick child needs the people closest to them. The weekly deaths are moments where his medical team almost loses him and then brings him back. The amnesia everyone has about his deaths is because inside his coma, his friends can't remember things that never really happened to them. Only Kenny remembers because only Kenny is really there. It's a tidy theory. It explains almost everything the show presents as supernatural with a single naturalistic premise. It makes Kenny the center of the story in a way that his character slightly deserves but never quite gets. And it makes the entire show a portrait of a sick child's rich interior life, which is a sad and kind of beautiful way to read it. The problem with the theory, or rather the limitation, is that the show has a lot of real-world events in it that Kenny would have no reason to imagine. The boys watch presidential elections play out. They react to real natural disasters. Celebrities come and go in real time. If the show were inside Kenny's head, he would need to be keeping up with the news in a way that feels unrealistic for a comatose child. Unless you expand the theory to say the news is coming in through his hospital room's television, which is possible, I suppose, but that's doing a lot of work. There's a softer version of the theory that I think actually holds up better, and it's just that some of the more extreme things in the show are kid perception exaggerations, rather than the whole show being a hallucination. Kenny really is a kid who gets hurt a lot because his family is poor and neglectful, and he's constantly left to fend for himself. The deaths aren't really deaths. They're injuries that feel like deaths to a 10-year-old watching them. The nobody remembers isn't supernatural amnesia. It's the ordinary way that kids and families move past difficult moments because dwelling on them is too painful. The supernatural reading is a child's interpretation of a set of circumstances that, if you describe them to an adult, would be less about cosmic horror and more about social services. I think this reading works better because it doesn't have to explain away the whole show. It just suggests that the emotional temperature of the show, the sense that everything is dire, everything is existential, everything matters enormously, is the emotional temperature of being a kid, and that the paranormal framing is the show giving you permission to feel that temperature without dismissing it. There's one more element to this theory I want to mention because I think it closes the argument nicely. The show, for all its supernatural stuff, is often at its best when it's smallest, when it's just the boys talking to each other at the bus stop, when Stan has an argument with his dad, when Butters has a quiet moment at home, when Kyle is doing his homework and thinking about what's fair. The most memorable South Park scenes are often the least cartoony ones, which would be strange if the show were fundamentally about cosmic horror and interdimensional entities. But would make perfect sense if the show were fundamentally about what it feels like to be a kid and the supernatural stuff were just the show letting the feelings look as big as they actually feel. I'm not saying the coma theory is true. I'm not saying any of these readings are true. Is the "it's all in the boys' heads" theory confirmed? No. Denied? Also no. But I think the reason theories like this one keep getting generated by fans and keep feeling emotionally resonant is that the show keeps leaving room for them. The show could, at any point, have locked itself into either a purely satirical or a purely supernatural reading. It hasn't. It's let both sit alongside each other for a genuinely long time and trusted viewers to figure out which one they're watching on any given night. That's quite generous, actually, as far as long-running television goes. Most shows tell you exactly what you're supposed to think. South Park keeps the door open, which is a good segue, I think, into the biggest and least supernatural theory of all. The one that isn't about what's happening inside the show, but about what the show itself is. Because the real question, the one that I think explains more about South Park than any in-universe theory ever will, isn't about the boys or the town or the curse. It's about the people making it and the conditions under which they're making it, and the genuinely improbable fact that this thing has kept running at all. Here's an image that I find hard to shake. 6 or 7 people in a small editing room in Culver City, California, at around 3 a.m. on a Wednesday. One of them has just finished rendering a scene. Another is rewriting a line in real time because the voice performance that was recorded an hour ago didn't quite land. A third is running an edit against a running clock because the episode has to be transmitted via satellite to Comedy Central in about 2 hours, and it is not yet finished. They have had very little sleep. They have been working on this episode since Thursday. Today is Wednesday. The episode airs at 10 tonight. This is, more or less, how almost every South Park episode for the last 20 years has been made. We touched on this briefly at the top of the video, but I want to come back to it properly because I think the real conspiracy of South Park, the real one, the one that isn't about Cthulhu or time loops or cursed burial grounds, is the conspiracy of getting this show made, week after week for this long at this pace. The documentary 6 Days to Air captured this in 2011, and it's worth watching if you haven't. because the footage of a 3 a.m. rendering progress bar is a more accurate portrait of the show than any theory about the boy's true nature. Let me put this in context for a moment. Most animated sitcoms have a production timeline measured in seasons, not weeks. A typical episode of a mainstream animated show takes the better part of a year, end to end, from script to broadcast. This is why most animated shows are so bad at commenting on current events. By the time the episode airs, the event is ancient history. South Park broke this rule, and it broke it deliberately. By cutting the production timeline down to essentially nothing, the show made itself uniquely able to react to the world in near real time. A major political event on a Monday can be on the show on a Wednesday. A celebrity scandal on a Saturday can be the plot by Wednesday. This is why the show has always felt alive in a way that most animation doesn't. It's moving at the speed of the news cycle because it's being made at the speed of the news cycle. The cost of that, obviously, is human. Roughly 70 people work on each episode. And during a production week, many of them are putting in 100 to 120-hour weeks. That is not a sustainable way to make television. It is, by any reasonable definition, a survival sprint, week after week, for most of the year, for decades. The people who work on South Park do genuinely punishing work under genuinely punishing time pressure. And they have been doing it for longer than some of them have been adults. That's the first real conspiracy. How does anyone keep doing this? Why hasn't the crew collapsed? The answer is probably some combination of ironclad contracts, a shared creative culture, and the simple fact that when you've been doing something for this long, stopping becomes harder than continuing. But it's still astonishing to me when I think about it. The show has also, across its run, picked up a fairly impressive award shelf. It has won 5 Primetime Emmys for Outstanding Animated Program, for episodes including Best Friends Forever, Make Love, Not Warcraft, Margaritaville, Raising the Bar, and the Imagination Land Special. It has received a Peabody Award, which is the sort of prestige honor that usually goes to serious documentary work, not to cartoons involving talking Christmas poo. The creative team has also received an Annie Award for writing, a Critics' Choice Award for Best Animated Series, and an Academy Award nomination for the song Blame Canada from the 1999 film. Which is a genuinely strange sentence to write. Parker and Stone have been nominated for an Oscar. But it's true, and it happened. The show has also quietly been a prolific parent of controversy. The banned episodes we talked about earlier, Super Best Friends, the Cartoon Wars 2-parter, and the 200 and 201 duo are the headline examples. But there have been others. The season 23 episode Banned in China got the entire franchise blanket banned in mainland China because it depicted the Chinese government's influence on American entertainment in ways the Chinese government didn't appreciate. South Park is, as of now, completely unavailable in one of the largest television markets in the world. Parker and Stone's response to this was a public apology so obviously sarcastic that it essentially doubled down on the original offense. That was itself perfect South Park. Then there's the Isaac Hayes situation, which I want to talk about because it's one of the quieter, sadder, real-world stories behind the show. Isaac Hayes voiced Chef, the sensible adult voice in the town, for the first 9 seasons. He was also, in real life, a Scientologist. In 2005, South Park aired the episode Trapped in the Closet, which is a ferocious satire of Scientology, particularly of Tom Cruise. Hayes was reportedly upset about it, though there was some dispute at the time about whether the objection was fully his or whether it was coming through him from the church. Either way, he left the show in early 2006. Parker and Stone's response in the season 10 premiere was to kill Chef off. The mechanics of it are a bit brutal. Because Hayes was no longer available to record new dialogue, they spliced together Chef's lines from existing recordings, stitching him into a new story that depicted him being brainwashed by a cult, a fairly transparent satire of what had happened to Hayes himself, and then having him fall off a cliff, get impaled, and get eaten by a bear, Then, in case the point wasn't clear, a second bear. The episode is called The Return of Chef, and it is, on the one hand, a very Parker and Stone response to a creative disagreement. It is, on the other hand, a genuinely uncomfortable piece of television. A character an actor had voiced for a decade was killed off using spliced versions of his own voice. The audience was left to process that. Hayes died in 2008, 2 years after his departure. The friendship between him and the creators never fully recovered. The show continued. Chef is canonically dead, and the way the show handles Chef's memory in later seasons is, to my eye, a bit wounded. The character is referenced warmly now and then, but never in a way that tries to undo what the show did with him. They made their choice. They live with it. I want to mention one more real-world moment before we pull back because I think it's genuinely telling. In September of 2024, Parker and Stone announced that they were delaying season 27 of the show specifically so that they wouldn't have to make episodes during the American election. The stated reason was that they were tired of parodying Donald Trump, and that running the show through another election cycle would mean they'd be making Trump as Mr. Garrison episodes for another 6 months, and they simply didn't want to. So they took the season off. Season 27 eventually aired in 2025 in a condensed 5-episode format, and season 28 followed immediately after in the same year. That's a genuinely unusual creative decision. A long-running show electing to sit out an election year because the showrunners would rather not engage with the material. It tells you something about the current state of satire and about how exhausting it is to keep making topical comedy about a political landscape that has become, in the showrunners' own words, not especially fun to satirize anymore. Parker and Stone have made satire out of basically everything across their careers. When they choose to decline a particular subject, that's information. All of which is to say, the real conspiracy of South Park isn't anything the boys have gotten up to. It's the fact that this specific machine, this ridiculously compressed production pipeline, this small crew, these 2 men at the creative helm, has been running continuously through deaths of cast members, through religious controversies, through geopolitical bans, through the transition from basic cable to streaming, through the pandemic, through the shift of entire generations of American comedy without stopping. South Park has outlasted every other show it came up with. It has outlasted most of its own cultural moments. It has outlasted the format of television itself. The show that was made for watching on cable at 10 p.m. is now being watched on phones, in streaming queues, by people who were not born when it started. The deal Parker and Stone signed with Paramount in 2025 is worth, according to the reporting, somewhere in the region of $1.5 billion. It locks the show in through roughly 2029 or 2030, which means the machinery will keep running as of the current plan for at least another half-decade. The boys will stay 10, the town will stay small, the episodes will keep getting made at the same impossible clip. The real conspiracy, in other words, is not ending. That's almost a strange thing to sit with. A show about a small, cursed-seeming town made by a tiny crew under impossible conditions, being guaranteed to persist for another half-decade. The fictional South Park is stuck in time. The real South Park production, in its own way, is also stuck in time. They're making television the same way they were making it in 2002, and they will be making television the same way in 2030. There is something genuinely strange about a creative enterprise that has decided, more or less, to become unchanging on purpose. To freeze like its characters have frozen so the work can keep happening, which is a feeling the show itself, at its best, taps into. And it's the feeling I want to close with, because underneath all the theories, underneath the supernatural, underneath the satire, underneath the real-world production mess, there is one thing about South Park that has always quietly been true, and it might be the deepest conspiracy of the entire show. There's a shot the show has been opening and closing episodes with, in various forms since the pilot. A wooden bench, a yellow sign, snow on the ground, and 4 small figures in bright winter coats standing in a row, waiting for the school bus. That's it. That's the image. It has been the visual anchor of the show for nearly 3 decades. Whatever else happens in an episode, whatever cosmic horror arrives, whatever elaborate Cartman scheme unfolds, whatever version of hell opens underneath the town, the episode usually starts with, or circles back to, that same bus stop. 4 kids, talking about something, waiting, and I think if you ask me, that's the deepest conspiracy in South Park. Not Cthulhu, not the burial ground, not the Illuminati testing their experiments on a Colorado town. The deepest conspiracy is the one the show hides in plain sight every episode, in the transitional shots you barely notice. The conspiracy is that 4 kids have been standing at that bus stop, in that order, having roughly the same kinds of conversations for longer than most friendships last. Think about it for a second. Stan and Kyle have every reason to stop being best friends. Kyle is often exhausting, Stan is often depressed. They have, in various episodes, been driven apart by girls, by arguments, by whole arcs where they don't speak. They always come back. Cartman has demonstrably tried to ruin Kyle's life on multiple occasions. He has attempted to engineer Kyle's spiritual or physical destruction in episodes that, if you stack them up, would constitute a legal case. Kyle should not, by any reasonable standard, still be standing next to Cartman in the morning cold. And yet, he is. Kenny has, as we've talked about, been dying for decades, and his friends have been forgetting it and showing up for him again the next morning. Over and over, the amnesia keeps resetting them. They keep choosing, even without memory, to come back. Whatever this is, it's not a normal friendship. A normal friendship would have ended by season 3. I think that's the thing that sneaks up on you about South Park if you watch it for long enough. Underneath the crudeness, the satire, the shock value, the thing it's always been quietly about is the persistence of being known by people. The boys know each other. They know each other completely. They know Cartman is going to be awful. They know Stan is going to be sad. They know Kyle is going to argue. They know Kenny is going to be hungry and cold and eventually gone. They know all of this. And they keep showing up in the snow, in the dark, waiting for a bus that, across the whole run of the show, has never quite arrived the way they expect. That's a lot to ask of a friendship. That's a lot to ask of any relationship, really. And the show, for all its refusal to be sentimental, has been quietly building a monument to that kind of persistence. 4 boys, a bench, another morning. The post-COVID specials, which we keep coming back to, are the one time the show stepped outside this image, and it showed us what the absence of the bus stop looks like. Stan, estranged from Kyle, living in the city, having made a life that doesn't include his old friends. Kyle, alone, waiting for a reunion that can only happen because someone died. Cartman, somewhere else entirely, trying to be a different kind of person. The image of the bus stop is broken in those specials, and you feel its absence more than you feel any plot point. The boys apart is wrong. It reads as wrong even in the episodes where it's happening. The show knows it, the characters know it, I think, on some level. And then the timeline resets, and they're 10 again, and they're at the bus stop again. Because the show cannot let go of the image. And maybe, underneath the choice to keep them frozen, that's what the time freeze has been about the whole time. Not a curse, not a conspiracy, just the writers refusing to let the bus stop empty out, refusing to let the friendships end, refusing to let the kids grow up and drift apart the way real friendships drift. I keep thinking about the real-world layer under this too. Parker and Stone, the 2 men making the show, have been working together since they were students. They have made this thing side by side for decades. They are themselves a version of Stan and Kyle. And the bus stop is, in a way, the monument they have been building to their own friendship. It holds because they hold. It persists because they persist. When they eventually stop making South Park, which they will someday no matter what the current streaming deal says, the bus stop will finally empty for real. The boys will finally stop waiting. And whenever that happens, I think a lot of us who have grown up with the show are going to feel something odd and hard to name. Here's a detail I find genuinely touching, even though it's small. The bus never actually comes on time. Across the run of the show, the bus is often late or never arrives or delivers the boys somewhere unexpected. The boys at the bus stop are not actually being transported anywhere reliably. They are just there, waiting, talking to each other about nothing. The bus stop is not a pickup point for a journey. It's a place where the four of them happen to stand each morning in roughly the same position, saying approximately the same things. The bus is a pretext. The standing around is the point. The show, I think, has always known this. The bus is not the destination. The bus was never the destination. The destination is that you have 3 other people to stand in the cold with, which, when I watch the show in that frame, stripping out the supernatural, stripping out the satire, stripping out the long run of accumulated plot, becomes something unexpectedly moving. South Park is a show about childhood friendship the way actual childhood friendship is. Ordinary mostly, boring, often, irritating, frequently, and at the same time completely unique. The specific combination of these 4 specific kids at this specific bus stop in this specific small town is something that could not be replaced by any other combination. When Butters was briefly the 4th friend in season 6, it did not work. It was fundamentally the wrong shape. The show tried and immediately rejected it. Because the real conspiracy of South Park is that this particular set of people and no other set belongs at that bench. That's a weird thing to believe about cartoon characters, and yet, all right, I think it's about time. We've spent a good long while with these boys in their cursed little town. There are more theories I could get into, and maybe I will in another video because I don't think we'll ever really be done with South Park as long as South Park isn't done with itself. But I think that's enough for tonight. The hour is late, you've been lovely company, and I think it's time to start saying goodnight. Thank you for sticking around, whether you made it all the way here or whether you drifted off somewhere back in the middle and are only catching the last bit now. Either way, thank you. It's genuinely nice to have had the company. We covered a lot of ground tonight. The origin shorts, the autobiographical layer, the boys who never age, the curse that keeps Kenny dying, the lighter theories about funeral costs and muffled parkas, the 12-year payoff of Cartman's paternity hidden inside episodes most people can't legally watch, the reading of Cartman as the show's true antagonist, and the softer counter-reading where he's just a damaged kid the writers refuse to abandon. The quiet tragedy of Butters' stotch, and the Victor Chaos placard that told us exactly where the writers were afraid he was heading. The cursed town theories, the Illuminati testing ground, the thin place where dimensions overlap. The gentle suggestion that none of the supernatural stuff is really real, and that we've been watching a group of kids render their own lives at 10 times their actual size. The real-world machine that has kept making the show at an impossible pace for longer than some adults watching have been alive. And finally, the 4 boys at the bus stop. Always 4, always at the bus stop. I think what I keep coming back to after spending a couple of hours in that town tonight is that South Park works because it refuses to tell you what it is. It could have been a satire. It could have been a supernatural drama. It could have been a coming-of-age series. It could have been a political show. Across decades, it has just let itself be all of those at once, and the viewer is trusted to sort it out. Some weeks it's satire. Some weeks it's a proper piece of mythology. Some weeks it's just fart jokes, and some weeks, if you're paying attention, it's something quietly sad that will live in the back of your head for years. Not every show gets to do that. Not every show is allowed to be that messy. I think the reason South Park has been allowed to be that messy is that it was never really designed. It just grew. 2 mates made a cartoon Christmas card, somebody passed it around, a network signed on, and a production cycle started that never quite stopped. The mess is the point. The inconsistency is the point. The show is what it is because it was never planned to be any particular thing. All right, that feels like a place to land. Although, one more small thing and then I really will go. I was thinking, while putting this together, about the fact that these kids, Stan, Kyle, Cartman, Kenny, Butters, all of them, have been around for longer than quite a lot of real human friendships. If you started watching the show in your teens in the late 90s, you are probably closer to 45 than 35 now, and yet they are still 10. That's a weird kind of relationship to have with a piece of entertainment. They remember less about you than you remember about them, obviously, because they aren't real. But in a sort of strange reverse way, they have been a consistent presence in a lot of people's lives through years where the rest of life has changed completely. Jobs have changed, cities have changed, people have come and gone, and the boys have been there in the snow at the bus stop. There's something comforting about that, honestly. The world is loud, the news cycle is exhausting, everything real seems to be in a state of permanent reinvention. And then there's this small, made-up mountain town where Randy is doing something stupid, Cartman is being awful, Kyle is upset about it, Stan is absorbing it all, Kenny is dying, and Butters is being grounded. Somehow, that is stabilizing. The show is consistent in the specific way only a long-running cartoon can be consistent. It will be there tomorrow, it will be there next week, it will, barring something unforeseen, be there in 2030. And the theories will keep being theories. The burial ground will keep not being confirmed. Kenny's curse will keep being mostly canon and mostly unexplained. Cartman's father will keep being locked inside the episodes nobody can stream. Butters will keep being grounded. The bus will keep being late. The boys will keep standing there, waiting for it. Right, I'm going to stop. For real this time. One last thing though, and then I'll go. I was thinking earlier about how the show started as a VHS Christmas card that got passed around Hollywood in 1995. Someone made a thing, someone else copied it, someone else copied that. And the copies found their way into the hands of the people who could turn it into something bigger. That's how this whole thing started. Just a tape getting handed from one person to the next. And I think there's something quietly lovely about the fact that this video, in its own tiny way, is the same thing happening again. Decades later, me talking about the show, you listening? Maybe you'll mention one of the theories to someone tomorrow, or next week, or never. It's a small chain, but it's the same kind of chain. Stories about stories, getting passed along, keeping the thing alive. If you're still awake, I hope the rest of your night is soft. If you're already asleep, I hope you stay that way for a long time. And if you happen to dream tonight about a small frozen town where nothing ever quite makes sense and everything somehow adds up anyway, well, you wouldn't be the first. Sleep well,